Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Stu Clark. Today we're going to take a look at the shooting modes on Nikon cameras. So we're looking at the P, which is program mode, A for aperture priority, S for shutter priority, and then manual mode. All of these play a part in photography, and they all have certain genres of photography where they might be the preferred mode to shoot. When we're looking at wildlife photography, typically aperture priority or manual mode are going to be the two that are most likely talked about. With wildlife photography, it's very different than landscape photography, very different than portraiture in that, if you're going to go and set up, shoot a model, you've got a subject that you are pose this way, pose that way, you set the lighting, you've got control of the scene. With wildlife photography, things happen fast. And that is why when you're picking your photo mode, you're trying to make it where more often than not, either you or the camera guesses right. And so when you're trying to decide on which mode to go with, you're trying to hedge your bets on that you're going to catch the shot based on the settings that you've got in camera. I've been shooting wildlife over 20 years now, and aperture priority has always been my go-to. So with aperture priority, it's a bit different than what you might think. So with aperture priority, you set the aperture, and with wildlife, generally it's a combination of lens sharpness and depth of field for your subject. So typically with wildlife, you're dealing with, depending on what your lens is, you're going to be f4, 5.6 to f8, and you're generally not going to shoot lower than f8. It'd be rare that you go below f8 unless you're using a teleconverter in that sort of situation. For me, using my 200 to 500 with the 5.6, I typically shoot at either 5.6 or 6.3. We'll sometimes stop it down to f8 if it's an elk, a bear, sometimes something where I need a little bit more depth of field and I have lots of light. So aperture priority is you set the aperture. So basically, when I walk out the door, camera set at 5.6, 6.3, depending on the subject I'm going for. Then the camera will pick the shutter speed. The variable that I have control over is ISO. And the reason that all the years that I was using aperture priority is as long as your subject was in focus and you had enough shutter speed, ISO was the single biggest variable for image quality. And you go back to Nikon, D200 days, D300 days, you never really wanted to shoot much above 800 ISO. 800 ISO was kind of the ceiling for image quality. So ISO is not nearly the hard ceiling it used to be because software has gotten so good. So and that has changed the game a little bit, and we'll talk about that as we kind of go through these different modes. So with aperture priority, how it works is that, I said, I walk out the door, I set the aperture. I don't change that again. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to control the ISO and the exposure compensation. They're going to be the two things that I take control of when trying to expose my subject properly. In aperture priority, you change the aperture. So this would be as you head out the house, you're going to be setting your aperture basically based on the sharpest setting for your lens. Or if you need a little bit of depth of field for your subject, you might stop it down a little bit. But basically, you're going to head out the door and you're going to change the aperture based on your subject. So you can see here, when I have manual ISO, as I change the aperture, you can see the camera picks the shutter speed. Notice how the histogram doesn't really change. There's a little bit of change as it's in between flicking. So with aperture priority, the one variable, so you go out, you set your aperture for your subject and your camera sharpness, and then what you're going to change is going to be the ISO. So basically, you're going to change the ISO based on the minimum shutter speed required for your subject. So if this was an owl, for example, on a branch, they are very slow to move. So what you're going to do in this situation, you can shoot it, if you're on a tripod, you can shoot down to 1/30th of a second, no problem, especially if you've got vibration reduction in your lens or in-body image stabilization in your camera. You can shoot at very low shutter speeds. So in this situation here, in order to get your ISO 1000, you're going to have your ISO as low as possible based on a subject that's not moving very much. say it's my backyard setup, I'm photographing chickadees. Chickadees are going to be a 1/250 of the second subject. So in these ones, I'm going to turn my ISO up to get my shutter speed to 1/250 of the second. So I'm going to be up to ISO 8000. And I've done a whole video on shutter speeds that are required to freeze your subject. And I'll leave a link down below for that. And so when you're trying to make that decision, it's with aperture priority, it's all about you are the one controlling the ISO and trying to maximize the image quality based on ISO. So what you do as you're shooting away, you're looking at your shutter speed in through the viewfinder, and you're just adjusting the ISO to keep your shutter speed at that 1/200 minimum. And then you're always kind of playing that game of the minimum ISO to the minimum shutter speed to freeze your subjects, where it's not going to be 100% at 1/200ths, but you're basically playing that game when you're dealing with animal portraiture. So this is where we're talking about animal portraiture, and that's where a lot of what I did throughout the years is animal portraiture, not necessarily action shots. Action shots are a little bit different for your settings with action shots, but for animal portraiture, aperture priority is great because you are taking full control of the camera to get the maximum quality out of your camera. You're getting the maximum quality of your subject. A good example would be, you've got, a great horned owl on an amazing perch, great background. It's a big bird, so you're probably going to drop your aperture down to f8. It's a subject that's not going to move a lot, so you can have very low shutter speed. You can shoot that if you're on a tripod, 1/20th of a second, 1/30th of a second, no problem. Especially if you use things like mirror lockup back in the day with DSLRs, and nowadays it's not as much of an issue. You can just press the button. But because you can shoot such low shutter speeds, you can then take control of your ISO and have very low ISO to maximize the image quality. So you get the highest dynamic range possible, the highest color possible. And that's why aperture priority was always the preferred method for so many wildlife photographers, is that it allowed you to kind of maximize image quality. And that was always the goal and always the game going out the door. Top quality possible. With P mode is one I've actually never used. I don't know if I've ever turned it on the camera. And P mode is essentially is as close to automatic mode on a semi-professional or professional Nikon camera. And basically in P mode, the camera picks the aperture and the camera picks the shutter speed. So it's basically an automatic mode. And for wildlife, I would never encourage using this. That's more of a snapshot mode, for family and friends, that sort of thing. Just because it's going to invariably, I find it always goes the wrong way. It'll boost the ISO too high. It'll drop the aperture too low, things like that, shutter speed too low. So it's not my preferred mode, and I personally would never recommend using it. So in P mode, again, this is one I never have used, but you can see you can adjust the aperture, and as you adjust the aperture, it will adjust the shutter speed accordingly. When camera optima, where the cameras kind of pick the settings, you'd see it's f3.5 at 1/50th, and the P is just at the top left corner there. When I start to make changes, you can see there's a star that pops up, basically telling you that some changes have been made. And it just, yeah. So like I said, this is more of a manual mode, and this would not be my preferred shooting style. So I wouldn't really recommend this other than for like family events and, basic snapshot photography. Generally not a use you'll use with these cameras. Yeah, so shutter priority, it's one where if you're not using auto ISO, it will have a tendency to underexpose in a lot of wildlife situations. And how it works is that if you're at a hockey rink, for example, where you get there, you've got a fixed light. You get there, you set your shutter speed to 1/1000. That's what you know is you need to have for capturing the action of the hockey game. That 1/1000 then, you can then set your ISO accordingly, and you know that you're always going to be at 1/1000th of a second, and you have very little variability in the scene throughout the entire shoot. So setting your shutter priority, I know a lot of sports photographers like shutter priority because they want to set that minimum. But what happens is if the light was to change, your aperture is wide open, you're at 1/1000th, the only way it can change is to drop the exposure. You're going to underexpose or overexpose unless you're changing your ISO. And that's the problem with shutter priority from a wildlife situation, that You might not notice that the light's, the light's constantly changing. The sun's moving, shape, shadows, clouds, everything. So from a nature standpoint, light is a constant change. So trying to go out and set your shutter speed at 1/1000, your aperture at 5.6, you are constantly trying to change the ISO to get your exposure accurate. So shutter priority does not make sense for wildlife at all. And that's one reason I would never personally use shutter priority. That's why I never have used shutter priority. It's just because the camera, the variable the camera's picking when you pick shutter priority is aperture. It's fine for the overexposure. It'll close the aperture down, but it can only open it up so much. So shutter priority is going to be far too much variability and potential for underexposing when using shutter priority. So it doesn't make sense for wildlife photography for me. Shutter priority with auto ISO, yeah, that would definitely work. And that could definitely, it's very similar to how I shoot with manual mode. And they said the reason I've chosen manual mode was because of the need to shoot manual mode with video. So in shutter priority, you now have control over the shutter. One thing that's interesting with shutter priority, something to be aware of, is that, and this is the problem with shutter priority, is that you don't necessarily see when it's getting underexposed. So what happens is, you can see the aperture here. The aperture changes as you change the shutter speed. So ISO is fixed at 1000. I've set the ISO, and the shutter speed moves accordingly. The problem here is once I get to wide open, you see at 1.8 it's starting to flash because now it's getting underexposed. The problem is it's not showing in the viewfinder, and this is set where it does show the exposure in the viewfinder, so you won't see it. Also, you notice the histogram's not changing, even though this photograph is almost black. So the camera's not showing you that this is completely underexposed, and that's the big issue with shutter priority. Not only can you not see it, I don't know why the camera's not showing it, it should be, but chances of having an underexposed shot are really easy because you won't know that it's changing. If you switch this to auto ISO, then definitely you can see shutter priority with auto ISO is very similar to manual mode and how I'd shoot it, and that would work fine. But shutter priority without using auto ISO, I think you're far more likely to end up with an underexposed image, and why I don't personally like to shoot in shutter priority. Shutter priority, again, it's one that I've never used. It's just a mode that I'm sure there's a lot of photographers that use it, and with any of these modes, I think they all have a place, and it's about, if it works for you, great. And I would never say, like, you get something, back in the day it used to be, if you didn't shoot manual, you were a beginner. I would never say that. I don't actually agree with that in a lot of cases, because with wildlife photography, there's so many instances where things can happen so fast that you need to have some automatic function available within the camera in order to kind of capture the subject and take advantage of those quick moments. The downside of shooting aperture priority is, say you've got that great horned owl and you're shooting at 1/20th of a second at f8, everything's 200 ISO, it's brilliant, you're getting top quality, phenomenal photos. If all of a sudden a goshawk comes in and takes a pass at that great horned owl, or the owl all of a sudden goes and takes off after a squirrel, you're at the wrong setting. You are shooting very low. So all of a sudden you're trying to crank the ISO up, and you need to drop the aperture down. So you've got two things that you then are trying to change in order to kind of keep the shutter speed high enough for your subject. And that's something to always be aware of, is that with these settings, you're trying to maximize the image quality for the scene you're currently on, but sometimes the scene can change quickly. So that's where you have to be comfortable with what modes you're using so that you can quickly change the settings as need be. With ISO, it's just you press the ISO button, spin the dial, and you can quickly change your ISO as your subject or as the scene changes. So like I said, whichever mode you choose, I highly recommend sticking with it. Don't go between, don't try this one, don't try that one. Part of the reason I'm doing this video is I had a friend of mine contact me asking some questions about, shoot aperture priority, shoot manual mode. Everyone she shoots with now, some people recommend manual mode, some people recommend aperture priority, and kind of getting confused about what's the best and which one to jump, which one to use, and which one to go between. And I think sometimes it's just a matter of which one works for you and just get comfortable with it. They all work great, and just get comfortable with it. Having said that, in recent years, Nikon Z8 especially, with the Nikon Z8, as I've kind of really jumped into the video side of things, you shooting in manual mode has really started to, there's a real place for it, and let's discuss that now. So with manual mode, you pick the aperture, you pick the shutter speed, you pick the ISO, you pick everything. With one caveat, auto ISO has become excellent. As the cameras have gotten better with ISO, as the software, if you use Lightroom, Lightroom Classic with the new noise reduction is absolutely phenomenal. Anything 1600 ISO and higher, it's unreal. Even I'm happy shooting the Z8 up to 8000 ISO. Software plays a big part in some of these choices that I now make. Since getting the Z8, I've now switched to manual mode. And I shoot manual mode with auto ISO. Kind of makes you're kind of shooting in automatic mode, really. Now, manual mode, again, this is how I shoot now. And manual mode is great. It's once you get your head wrapped around it, and once you get it figured out, it works really well. And the main reason I had to switch to this was because of the video settings in the Nikon Z8. You really need it. With manual mode, you can see how the histogram, as I change the shutter speed, the histogram moves accordingly, so you can see whether you're clipping or not. Nice and simple, nice and easy. So manual mode, basically, head out the door, set my aperture to 5.6, set your shutter speed based on what you expect your subject to be. Like I said, I'd watch my videos on Shooting Bank A and Shooting Bank B, where I basically set the shutter speed up based on the subject I expect to see in a certain scene. And then you can see with the auto ISO, that just rides up and down as you adjust your shutter speed. So generally, I'll rarely change the aperture. Said you might change it to 5.6 or 6.3 depending on your lens sharpness. And then all I'm doing is I'm basically changing my shutter speed based on my subject. If I've got a static subject like an owl, I'll drop that down to like 1/30th of a second, so I can kind of maximize keeping my ISO as low as possible. But the camera is picking the ISO in this situation. So basically, I go out the door, just like with aperture priority. I set my aperture where I'm setting it at 5.6, 6.3, depending on the sharpness of your lens. You pick the sweet spot of the lens. So quick way to do, go out, shoot a brick wall. Shoot it at wide open, stop down, a thirds to f8. Basically wide open to f8. You're generally never going to go much below f8. So basically from wide open to f8, shoot your camera at all the different apertures, have a good look at 100% on Lightroom, figure out which is the sharpest aperture, and then which is still acceptably sharp. So with my 200, 500, 5.6, it's probably sharpest at f8. 6.3 and 5.6 I'm still really happy with. So I have no issues at all shooting the lens wide open. So then it just comes down to depth of field for your subject. And that's going to be, if you're shooting small birds, 5.6 is totally fine. If you're shooting a large game, you might want to shoot f8 if you have the light. Shutter speed. So this one is going to be, because you've got auto ISO shutter speed, you now will kind of set your shutter speed based on your subject matter. And also based on your location and based on your expected subject. As I've talked, if you watch any of my videos on setting up Nikon cameras and going out, we talk about going to the estuary, going into the forest. I have my Shooting Bank A is going to the estuary, going to the beach, and my Shooting Bank B is shooting in the forest. I go out the door at a different shutter speed based on the expected subject matter and based on the expected action. So if I'm going to the estuary, generally, I'm going to be minimum shutter speed of 1/1000. If it's a bright day, I'll even be 1/3200th of a second. I'll kind of push that shutter speed really quick, going to a really fast shutter speed. I said it's location based and subject based, where you figure you're going to run into a certain action scenario. You're going to walk out the door. Basically, you're going to set your aperture at 5.6. You're going to set your shutter speed at minimum 1/1000th, 1/2000th, 1/3200th of a second. Then the auto ISO, because so in the action scenario, going to the beach, going to the estuary, nice bright sunny day, you're going to have lots of light. So even though you're using auto ISO with a very fast shutter speed, your ISO is probably going to be 1600 ISO or lower in most situations because you're dealing with a bright day. If it gets, as it gets later in the evening, you might want to, if you're shooting at 1/3200th of a second, you might drop down to 1/2000th of a second or 1/1600th of a second in order to kind of keep that ISO in that 3200 range. That's kind of optimum with these cameras, even though the software is great up to 8000 ISO. 3200 is probably the comfortable ceiling for image quality, even though you can definitely shoot them higher and still get great shots. So that's where and then because you've got auto ISO, the camera is almost in automatic mode. Even though you've set your aperture based on your lens and subject matter, you set your shutter speed based on your subject matter and expected action, then the ISO, the camera just automatically picks the ISO. So you're, like I said, you're kind of in automatic mode. You've picked the two variables, the ISO then rides, and you just shoot away. And vice versa, when I say I'm going into the forest situation where I'm going to be shooting owls and, I'm going to be shooting slower subjects or even warblers and things where 1/500th to 1/640th of a second is typically going to be enough to freeze my subject. Even bird singing, 1/800th would probably be fine for even bird singing. You don't really need to be in that 1/2000th, 1/3200th of a second range. So you can control that. And you can basically, you adjust the shutter speed slower. So, when I walk into the forest, I generally set my shutter speed at 1/500th a second. Again, aperture, if you're shooting small birds, aperture at f5.6 or f6.3. And then the auto ISO will generally be 800 ISO, 1600 ISO. It'll kind of stay on the lower end. If I end up where I've got an owl lower light situation, owls are one where because they move so slow, you can knock that shutter speed right down. That's going to be you just knock your shutter speed down to 1/50th a second, 1/30th a second. Your ISO then is going to be dropped, and you're going to maintain that image quality and get a higher quality image by dropping your ISO lower. And then if any action happens, you just quick turn of the dial to adjust the shutter speed, and you're ready for action. And then your ISO is automatically adjusted for it. So that's the beauty nowadays. Like I said, with auto ISO and manual mode, it kind of works very similar to aperture priority back in the day, where you've got same sort of control of it, but it makes for easier action from action to portrait, quick switch of the dial. And I found that with auto ISO, you can manually set ceilings for how high you want to go with the ISO and then at what shutter speed as a minimum. So you can actually set your shutter speed minimums and your ISO maximums. So that's one of the things that you've got quite a bit of control. Even though you're dealing with auto with the ISO, you can kind of control it going out the door at how much of the parameters you can adjust for it. And that's one of the beautiful things if you watch any of my shooting bank videos, by having the different shooting banks kind of dialed in for these different subject matters and locations, just by changing shooting banks, I'm still shooting in manual mode. And so I don't recommend jumping between aperture priority and manual mode too much. I think you can start to confuse yourself. Having said that, I still like aperture priority for my real estate photography and landscape photography. I found that the auto ISO is not ideal when I'm dealing with a fixed subject. And that's the one time where, and so my shooting bank D is where I don't use auto ISO. And that's where, that's another thing where basically shooting bank D, you go back to everything kind of being more manual. And again, at aperture priority in manual ISO as opposed to auto ISO. So these are kind of where, like I said, each of these modes has got its place. The P mode, family, people coming, you've got that family event, stuff like that. P mode, great. Shoot P mode, nice and simple, easy. Aperture priority, I think, has got a great place as a wildlife photographer still. If you're using anything DSLR era, if you're not shooting in the current mirrorless era, I think DSLR, I think you taking control of ISO still makes sense. But in any of the newer cameras, auto ISO, I think auto ISO with manual mode really works well. And once you get used to it, so it's one of those, when I made the switch, it took me a while. One of the big reasons, it was kind of a forced switch, to be totally honest, is that the Nikon Z8, you almost have to shoot video in manual mode. And so because I had to switch to manual mode for video, it didn't make sense. I found my brain wanted to have manual mode for both photo and video. I find if you're going back and forth between modes, you start to fumble. And with wildlife photography, because of the action, the immediate action that you might all of a sudden, stuff happens, you don't want to be fumbling with the camera. So if you're going to switch to manual mode with auto ISO, commit to it and really get to know it and stay with it. Don't go back and forth. It's kind of like using the back button autofocus. Once you make the switch to it, just stick with it in all your modes, except for like a landscape or real estate or that sort of portraiture, for example, where you don't want auto ISO. And in those situations, I don't think you want auto ISO. But once you commit to it and you get used to it, it works really well. And I would highly encourage you to give it a go. So there you go. That's the skinny of it. So I hope that makes sense, and hope you can help you pick your shooting modes. Till next time, we'll see you out there. Take care.